Welcome to the Inspired by Adventure podcast, Season 3, Unique Entrepreneurs. Here is your host, serial entrepreneur, Wayne Brown.
Welcome to Inspired by Adventure, Season 3. I'm Wayne Brown, serial entrepreneur and this season's host. We will be exploring the lives of fellow entrepreneurs, how they got started, what motivates them, and share their business experiences. Entrepreneurs are a different breed. We're risk takers. Gut feeling drives a lot of our decisions, and we thrive on change. We have learned what it takes to surmount difficulties and create success against all odds. The fact that we and our companies are still standing is evidence enough that we have a wealth of knowledge to share with all of you. All right, good evening, everybody. Today we have as our unique entrepreneur, Amy Kurland. Amy founded the world famous Bluebird Cafe in Nashville. Even people that are not into country music have heard of the Bluebird Cafe. It's been called the Ellis Island for aspiring country music singers and songwriters. And if you want to make it in country music, you have to make your pilgrimage to the Bluebird Cafe. Amy, thank you for being with us today.
I'm delighted to be here, Wayne. Thanks for asking.
This is going to be probably one of the most unique entrepreneur segments we do this season. So I'm happy to have the time with you today. We always start asking a little bit about people's background, where they're from, how they ended up where they are today. And I think in your case, there's even some a little musical family history. So if you can give us a background, that would be great.
Sure. So my parents are both from Brooklyn, New York, and they knew each other in high school. But when they married, my father was a Juilliard-trained violinist, and he got a job teaching music at the University of Tulsa in Tulsa, Oklahoma. So I was born in Tulsa, but I really don't remember because we moved away. He went up to Ithaca, New York, and he taught at Cornell for a few years. And then when I was 8 years old, he got a job in Nashville at George Peabody College, again teaching music. One of the reasons he took that job is that the people down here in Nashville told him that if he worked as a college professor teaching music, he would get a lot of work in the recording studios on the side and make a lot of extra money. And that is, of course, exactly what happened. In fact, within 3 years, he quit being a college professor and worked full-time in the studio and ended up being, one of the top session players and certainly the top session violinists in Nashville at a time when music here was sweetened with violins. A lot of that countrypolitan sound of the 70s and early 80s is my dad.
That's great. So you decided back in the early 80s you were going to use some of your culinary training and open up a cafe.
Yeah, I went to college and I thought I would go to law school, and somewhere in that process I thought, no, I really want to open up a restaurant. And so I graduated from college with an English degree, and then I went to culinary school. I am a culinary school dropout. And then I started talking about opening up a restaurant. I had some money that my grandmother had left me, and I was dating a guitar player. This is very dangerous. I don't know. I suppose if you want to get in the music club business, that might be important, but otherwise it's not the greatest idea in the world. And he said, if you open up a restaurant, my friends and I will all come and play over there. And so that's what I did. I rented a place in my own neighborhood that I knew very well, and we put in a stage. And some friends I knew from high school, from growing up here, who were in the restaurant business, they became my kitchen staff, and the boyfriend and his buddies played music in the evening. So we had a very sweet little flowered tablecloth lunch place with a rock and roll club at night.
So, I've had the the great fortunate time to be there at the Bluebird a couple times in the past. The last has been a while. It's probably 2005 or six I was there. But reading some of your history, you originally was going to open up a gourmet style restaurant and maybe occasionally have music. When I was there, that certainly was not the way it was being managed and ran. So what occurred in those early years to change that?
Well, it's always the strangest things that determine your course in history. I mean, one of them is that the music was doing so well. Everybody liked coming to the Bluebird, and lots of great musicians were playing there, and they were getting discovered. Kathy Mattea got discovered at the Bluebird around 1982, and Steve Earle was playing at the Bluebird then, that sort of thing. And you couple that with the fact, and this is the ridiculous part, that we have a very small parking lot with neighbors sharing the parking. And so during the day when we were serving lunch, it was a constant battle over the parking, and it was a constant battle to keep cooks and keep servers doing a good job. And in the evening, it was a party. It was fun. There were no parking issues because all the other businesses around me were daytime businesses. So, when you think about what makes a business happen, sometimes it is something as simple as a parking issue. But we were doing pretty well with the lunch business, and I've been doing it for about 5 years, contending with those issues, and I was doing both. And that's a long day for a young person in business, to be going in at 8 or 9 in the morning, sometimes having to do the cooking because the chef didn't show up, staying till closing time. And I also had a tremendous feeling that I had no idea what I was doing. So I took myself over to the local community college and started taking a number of their small business classes. And the most meaningful of those classes, and I took, how to own and operate a small business and how to manage people, all of those things helped me tremendously. But the one that really made a difference was when I took a marketing class, because that was the first time that anybody said to me, you have to decide what it is you are doing, what it is you want to do. You cannot be everything to everybody. And I stood back and I looked at all the issues during the day with the lunch and all the fun during the evening with the music. And I said, I'm going into the music business. I'm going to drop the lunch business. It was just about 5 years after I had gone into business. And immediately I went from a fair amount of very poor financial records, in the red many, many months, to it starting to look a whole lot better because all that staff that's required for lunch was quite a drain.
Well, you obviously made the right decision at the right time, and has been a great addition to Nashville. A lot of especially young entrepreneurs starting out have so many ideas that they're working on, running around in their head. But obviously, we need to boil those down to focus on the one or two that's going to make a difference right now in our business. How have you, in your early career, when you had all those ideas that you wanted to work on, been able to get those down to the one or two you needed to focus on to be successful?
I say we're a music club, and when I started, I really didn't even think about what kind of music I wanted to have. Again, I wanted the boyfriend to have a place to play. Well, he was a loud electric guitar player, and he worked in bands. And I liked jazz, and jazz bands were calling me to play, and I was hearing from gospel bands, and that seemed like a good idea for Sunday nights. And then a beautiful thing happened. Somebody organized a writer's night, a show where the writers of the songs came up and one after the other played both the songs that they had had hits with and the songs that hadn't happened for yet. And the one thing about the club, the way it had been, was I got a lot of complaints that it was too noisy. It was just too loud. It's a small room, 1,500 square feet, including the kitchen. So here was this writer's night, and it was perfect. Nobody was holding their ears. Everybody was leaning in like this was the greatest thing they'd ever heard. Nobody was talking. And on top of that, it was the biggest night financially I'd had to date. And I was like, okay, I'm going to focus on writers' nights. And over the next few years, instead of just thinking about that focus, I just determined that Bluebird Cafe would be a songwriters venue. You get to know more and more of the songwriters, and it just makes sense. So these days, the Bluebird Cafe is a songwriters venue 95% of the time, and the other 5% is a blues band that we have some Monday nights.
That's great. We have here in Augusta, as they do in a lot of cities, an annual concert called the Guitar Pool. And it's all about the stars, the singers coming and just sitting up on stage. There'll be 3 or 4 at a time at that concert. And they sit up there and they chat and they talk about how the song was made and where they were and who wrote it and give personal stories. And then they sing it. And it's the hardest ticket to get in town every year because it's just a more intimate experience and people just love it. So I can certainly understand how that night became so popular with you there and at the Bluebird.
Yes, it's interesting because one of the comments I would get the most often would be from people in the audience who would say to me, I didn't really want to come because I don't like country music, but now that I've heard it presented by the singer of the song, I'm totally changed. I like this music now.
That's great. And it gives an outlet for the songwriters that don't always get to be in front of an audience and talk about how they wrote the song and where the inspiration came from.
Absolutely.
So let's talk about technology for a second, because obviously that is driving today drives everything we do. And so I'm sure it's changed quite a bit for you from the Bluebird when you started through today. I know, especially with the times we're in now, their Bluebird's doing YouTube open mic night, which is great use of the current technology. So how did it change from when you started back in the early 80s through today?
Well, I will just tell you that one of the things I did from a marketing perspective was I wanted to develop a mailing list so that I could send people postcards every month. Well, first of all, let's throw postcards out the window. It was expensive and it took a long time to turn that around, and now you can do it by email. But even better than that, in order to develop that mailing list, we decided to have a raffle, and we raffled off a Sony Walkman, which was a little portable cassette player. So that's how far things have come in my life, is a cassette player that these days you probably could only find one at a Goodwill store was a hot ticket at that time. Now, some of the technology is, the same as ever, maybe upgraded. You still have to have a sound system. They are digitized these days. They're computer run. It makes them a little easier to work with. Still have to have lights for the thing. In my day, we did not have, the servers didn't have, palm things that they could type in the orders on that would just show up in the kitchen. It was all handwritten on tickets with carbon copies. And, every time you make one of those moves, you think, why do I have to do this? It's going to be a big learning curve and it's going to cost me a lot of money. And then within a short period of time, you wonder how you ever did it the old way. It's saving you so much to have that technology, so much time and money. Now, I haven't been running the Bluebird for over 10 years now, but they did a number of streaming shows during COVID, but they didn't go, every day of the week like some of the venues did. I think Erica Willem-Nichols runs the Bluebird now and is doing a wonderful job. And I think she felt that that was not a great use of the downtime for the Bluebird. They've done a lot of streaming private shows, which is interesting in itself, but did not go to an online full calendar of shows. But it will be very interesting to see what happens as clubs return to business, whether they will include a streaming aspect. It would be a wonderful way to help the musicians make more money, right? There's nothing in it for the venue really, because you can't sell a drink in a basket of chicken fingers to somebody in 500 miles away. But if you can get an extra $5 or $10 in the basket for the musicians, that is a real bonus.
They always say that it takes disruptions to move businesses forward, and so obviously we've had a disruption here in the last 15 months. And even with all my businesses, we've created, I don't know if I put them all together, probably 50 or 60 ways to stay in front of customers when either they couldn't come to the business or couldn't travel. And probably 10 or 15 of those we'll keep doing, just like the Bluebird, doing open mic night, because they're great for business and make sense. And it was a great innovation that during this time that has helped us, have ways to stay in front of customers 24/7.
I mean, Erica it was very important to her to be in everybody's mind. It really helped. Some outside factors helped. The Academy of Country Music did their award show virtually, and they chose the Bluebird as one of their sites to do that from. So that was 2 different years. They got that national television exposure. But she continued to send our electronic newsletter every single week and filled it with newsy stuff. And she did, like you said, open mic, and their Golden Pick Award happened. And January is the month we raise money for our local nonprofit hospice, Alive Hospice. And she went on doing that. And they actually, more recently, now that it's okay, they did some in-person events. They did like Bluebird open house days, mostly to sell merchandise, T-shirts and, wine glasses.
I remember the first streaming mini concert I saw was actually, I think, a friend of yours, Ray Herndon, that did it in front of the Handlebar J.
Yeah.
And I happened to catch that and was thinking, man, this is a great way for all the musicians and singers and songwriters to be alive today in this time when they can be in front of as many people as they want without having to be live in person. So great way for every business to be able to continue engaging their customers. So I asked around some of my staff this week, what questions would you like Amy to answer? And one of them was about the change in country music that you've seen from when you started the Bluebird back in the early 80s to today.
Well, country music changes all the time, just like any other music. I mean, rock and roll music changes and blues music changes, maybe a little less. When I first went into business, country music was in a little bit of a slump. It was tired. I couldn't really even tell you who the big acts were at that point. But by the mid to late 80s, the new traditionalist movement had started with Ricky Skaggs and Randy Travis both bringing back a much more stripped down music, and the songs could be emotional and lyric based and everything else. From my father's day, the violins had been phased out, and we were back to small bands and maybe a banjo or a steel guitar. These days, country music seems to be very noise driven, to be honest with you, and I don't listen to it as much, so I'm not an educated person on this, but there's just a whole lot of mostly young men singing songs that are things that are lists about what they like. If you look at it, that's how I hear them. And there's a lot of light shows and a lot of hip thrusting. And people seem to love it. It's a party. And then there are other people who are out there still making lovely music. It's still lyrically based, but it's not like it's the end of country music or country music has wrecked itself or anything like that. Something else will come along. And of course, out of all that, you had a number of artists who sort of branched off into the Americana field, what would have been called country in 1990. And so you have your Jason Isbells and those people, and a whole other genre for people to listen to and, to fight about. So I don't. there is no way for me to project a future except for to say there is a future, and some people are going to like some of it, and some people are going to have to wait to like it later.
Sure, sure. It's funny. A lot of the new country artists, or whether, I guess maybe forever, they always sing about, what they do and what they like. And I thought it was interesting last week when I heard for the first time Darius Rucker's song Masterpiece, when he talks about everything he hasn't done. So I thought that was a great way for him to write a song that was so non-traditional, but seems like it's going to be a great hit. So let's talk about customer profiles, because they change and we have to change to adapt to them. So how are customers today at the Bluebird different than they were when you opened it in 1982?
We have all aged. The customer profile looks a lot like me. In 1982, there were a lot of 25 to 35-year-olds hanging out, and we have a much older audience now. I don't know that it's so much about the Bluebird. It is about what younger people are liking to do these days. And in Nashville, we have a whole part of town that is for people who like to drink and carouse and all that sort of thing. And that's downtown. And that's where the young people go. The Bluebird has a very strict listening room policy. You don't go in there and make noise and talk. And of course, there are young people who want to hear a concert and want to hear good music. And we get those people. But our core audience is probably 50 to 70 with their kids often. It can be families. We do get the occasional bachelorette party, but they have to be some pretty special bachelorettes, because we don't even let them in the door if they think they're there to whoop it up. And in some ways it's good for the Bluebird. People in that age range have plenty of disposable income. They come in and they're happy to spend and everything else. And I'm not so concerned that we will just age right on out of our audience, because one of the most important things about the Bluebird is that it is the songwriters who bring a crowd. So if we are constantly attracting the younger songwriters, the ones with songs on the charts now, then the people who like that music are the ones who will come. Even though most of my songwriter friends are people who had hits in the early 90s, and they still draw a crowd and they still put on wonderful shows. But over the years, the Bluebird is all about helping the songwriters, and so it cannot just be about having my old friends play there. You got to let the new people have their chance, and luckily songwriters of whatever age, they want to play in front of an audience that appreciates them and what they've done and written. A lot of songwriters, at one point or another, they may even have had dreams of being artists, and then turned out they didn't have the voice or the charisma or the looks or the drive or whatever. As far as I'm concerned, many of the Bluebird songwriters should be the biggest artists in the world, but they aren't. But they love to have that chance to come out and play in front of a crowd, an adoring crowd.
I'm always surprised when I'm at an event that the songwriters are displaying their talents and how well vocally, they can sing their songs. And I'm always like you, I'm always surprised that they didn't come out with it as a number one or number two, rather than just a songwriter. But they definitely are a very well-rounded, talented group for sure.
Absolutely. It could be something as simple as they wanted to have a home life. They wanted to get married and have children and see their children for supper every night and not go out on the road.
Absolutely. So, like you mentioned earlier, about 12 years ago, you stepped back from ownership of the Bluebird, but you wanted obviously to keep it dedicated to what you had established there as the institution in Nashville to singers and songwriters. So, how hard was that decision for you to decide to step back and let somebody else come in and manage?
I was experiencing a certain amount of burnout. As glorious as it was to run that place and get to know these songwriters and get to hear some of the greatest shows in the world, there is nothing glamorous or glorious about having to get up at 3 in the morning because the burglar alarm is going off or because the bartender locked themselves outside the back door. There's nothing fun about, you know, having the health department show up and have to make all those arrangements. And this is a tip for your entrepreneur audience, I was not good at hiring a manager and having somebody handle those little things for me. I didn't feel we had enough money, and I didn't really trust anybody else. So I did things as basic as clean out the grease trap and fix install new sinks if I had to. Good life skills, but at some point in there, I just reached a place of I want this place to go on forever. But eventually it's going to have to be without me. What is going to be that best way for that to happen? And I was driving around in the car and it suddenly came to me in a flash. I should give it to the Songwriters Association. Now, that was a pretty crazy thought, but I was at a place at that moment where I wouldn't have given it to just anybody, but that seemed like, oh, well, that would work. Well, I called up my old friend, Erica Willem-Nichols, who was working at the Songwriters Association. But she had worked for me at the Bluebird for many years as a server, in the office, as a bartender. And as a friend, I asked her what she thought of that idea. And she said, that's interesting. Let me talk it over with the other people down here. And she shepherded me through that process over the course of a year. I was never forced to do it too fast, or if I'd changed my mind, there wouldn't have been nobody would have held it against me. So I got to do it very gently, and they were so clear, that they wouldn't let me give it to them, that they would give me a discounted price, but something reasonable. And they would provide me with a little income based on the use of the name and the idea, because after all, that's what songwriters live on. And they didn't think it was a good idea for them to take somebody's creative idea and just take it away from them the same way you wouldn't want to do that with a song. And so over the course of a year, I made that decision. And I remember maybe a week before we were due to announce it to the public, I went in there all by myself and I sat down on one of our church pews in the back of the room. And I looked around and I had a much stronger feeling that I was sending my child off to a good college than that I was losing my child and I would never get to do that. And it's funny because people ask me all the time, do you miss it? Well, I live a mile from there. I don't miss it at all. I can visit anytime I want, and I do often. I drop in and I see a show, but it is never my responsibility, unless I want to take it on, to notice the paper on the floor needing to be picked up or the tables that need to be bussed. Now, that's not to say that I haven't done it sometimes, just because it's old habits die hard. But the Bluebird is more than it was in my day. Erica has done a wonderful job, making money on it. She's had some rough breaks, and she's obviously I didn't have to take it through COVID. I mean, that's a really rough thing. But I sold it to her just in time for the 2008 global economic meltdown, which actually I think worked out to her advantage. They were a little bit broke, but things were slow enough to where they could learn the business without it being too crazy. And right after that, they got the greatest big break in the world when ABC television decided to make a show called Nashville that the Bluebird was the centerpiece of. And that wasn't a moneymaker for them at the time, but it has been such an opportunity. Their merchandise sales went through the roof, and everything else about the Bluebird, did really well.
My wife and I were huge fans of that show, Nashville, when it was on. We never missed a show. You talked about early on when you started the business, and every entrepreneur goes through this the first few years, and sometimes it happens again if you have downturns. So when you had those tough times early on, what inspired you to keep your head up and keep pushing forward?
Pride and stubbornness. I really think that my worst character defects were the ones that kept me going. I didn't want to fail. I think everybody thought I would fail, and I just didn't want to be that person. I cleaned up my own personal act right away. Before the Bluebird opened, I used to drink in other people's bars and accept free drinks and stay after hours and be part of breaking the law and all that sort of thing. Well, boy, once it was my responsibility, that was not going to happen in my place because I had money invested in it, but it wasn't the money. It really was the pride. I wanted to do it right. And I think anytime things got tough, grace provided me with something that kept me going. I mean, over the years, we haven't even talked about this, but people got discovered in the Bluebird, including Garth Brooks. That's a pretty big thing to be part of his career. And the careers of songs that I loved that wouldn't have gotten onto the radio. To help out, I'm not musical, so to help out other musicians who I love, because I grew up around music, it's the greatest satisfaction in the world. I wish I could get up on stage and sing harmony. I can't do that, but I can surely provide that stage and provide an atmosphere where other people are really listening.
We have several small business roundtables here in Augusta that we have a group of entrepreneurs that have been through years and years of running their business, and we help new young aspiring entrepreneurs. And a lot of the questions we get are, what books should I be reading? What magazines should I be looking at? What websites should I look at, or newspapers I should be reading? Were there early in your career, were there things that you used from to give you inspiration on how you can help better manage and run your business?
Well, I will say that I belonged to a small business roundtable up here back in the day. And out of that group, and I know these books are old, but I think they still hold up, the E-Myth and 5-Minute Manager were two of the best management books and big picture books that I knew about at the time. As a member of the Restaurant Association, I was able to take a lot of classes through them, and like I said, through the local community college. I'm trying to think. I think you have to have a huge willingness to be curious and open-minded to what's going on in the world around you and in your own world. You cannot get so locked into what you think, how you think everything ought to be, as to just notice how it is going and what's working for you. And you can learn to do that through books, because that's helpful. But there's not a book that I kept by my bedside and referred back to or anything like that.
Outside of what we read and consume, every entrepreneur has had at least one mentor that they can look back on and say, wow, they gave me great advice, or they were a great sounding board when I wasn't quite sure what decision I should make. Have you had one of those or more of those in your career?
Oh, I think a few. I remember when I first got started, there was a sort of a local character. His name was Ed White, and he had run a club here in town called the Red Dog Saloon. And he helped he helped me buy some used restaurant equipment from another friend. So he had a little background. And one of the pieces of advice I remember the most clearly, he said, Amy, it's not your living room. Please don't get upset by anybody who stubs out, can you imagine, a cigarette in your carpet. You'll drive yourself crazy. Don't do that. So I loved having somebody was not a big picture guy. He was a down to earth, never hire a cocktail waitress kind of a guy. That was always a word. Hire somebody that you can train, not somebody who's figured out all the tricks. Uh, I suppose I had some musical mentors. There's a songwriter named Don Schlitz who wrote The Gambler and Forever and Ever Amen. And he was one of the early songwriters who played the Bluebird. And he started bringing in his friends to play. And I could trust that if Don chose somebody, they were going to be good. It was almost like Don's given me the nod. That was a good idea. So there's that kind of a mentor, somebody to kind of help you have a little extra confidence in your own abilities. And the guy who was the leader of my small business roundtable, I was in that thing for years, 10 plus. I mean, I didn't stop going until I left the business, and I would have kept going if it had been allowed because I liked it so much. And Al McCree, he was in a completely different business, but that group and his knowledge about how to run business, just to be able to sit around with other peers and say, man, having employees is a pain, isn't it? And how we dealt with it. Sometimes it was real basic stuff, how to buy insurance. And sometimes it was bigger picture things. It was a therapist I had who suggested I go to the community college, and it was somebody to whom I confessed, I don't think I know what I'm doing. And instead of saying, oh, of course you do, they said, no, you don't. Here, why don't you go take a class? So many ways. And I think part of that is based on acknowledge your weaknesses and don't be embarrassed by them.
You talked about your mentor talking about somebody putting out a cigarette in your living room and don't let it get to you. In every business I've had, where they've always been customer oriented businesses. And so I've always had my staff come to me and say, oh man, this customer is such a pain. They're difficult, and they take a lot of my time, and they're high maintenance. And I always tell them, even today, those customers know they're high maintenance. They know they're difficult. And if you take care of them, they're going to be our most loyal customers ever, because they don't want to go anywhere else because they know they might not be able to survive with another owner somewhere.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing because, like I said at the Bluebird, the key to good business was to get the songwriters to want to play at the Bluebird more than anywhere else. And so they were in many ways our customer. We provided them with a working sound system and an audience that was quiet and listening, and a lot of things that they really wanted. Even though what they didn't get was a green room with a hospitality basket in it. They didn't even make the most money, but they were getting what they wanted. And that put us at a little bit of a loggerhead. Who are you trying to please? Do I let the customer, the guy who's paying me for the drink, talk? Or do I make them be quiet because if I run off the songwriter, I'll never get him back? And we opted for the songwriter. And the Bluebird's small enough to where we can afford to have the customer base that we want, people who care about the music.
So my wife and I saw there was a documentary made on the Bluebird. So we watched it this weekend. And kind of to wrap this up with a final question, in that documentary, you talk about where the name Bluebird Cafe came from.
Okay, well, I went to the bank. You have to open up a bank account just to start buying the wood and the chairs and the tables and everything to build it. And they said, what do you want to call it? I'm like, I hadn't even thought about that yet. That opening it up was still months out. And a couple of names came to mind. The 4104 Club, because our address is 4104 Hillsborough Road. Or Grandma's Money, because that was how I paid for it. And sort of out of nowhere, the name Bluebird Cafe sprang to mind. And I can't really say where it came from, but I will say there are Bluebird Cafes all over the world. and all of them are independent. There's one in Amsterdam, and there's one in Moscow, and there's one in Denver, Colorado. And when Andy and Barney would go up to Mount Pilot to eat, they would eat at the Bluebird. So anyway, I woke up this next morning, and just the one I liked best was Bluebird Cafe. And I said, okay, it's Bluebird Cafe. And to this day, I can be walking through Kroger or wherever, and somebody may yell out, "Hey, Bluebird." And I'm just so happy they're not saying, "Hey, Grandma."
That's great.
Yeah.
Great story. Any last advice you'd want to give to any aspiring entrepreneurs that are trying to make a successful business?
We do a lot for our community. Don't forget to take the resources and the gifts that you are given. In my case, it was space, to do something to make your local community a better place. So at the Bluebird, we, for many years, did a children's show that was free, and kids got bussed in from different schools. We still do a senior citizens show, and that's been great. And we do a lot of benefits, raising money for local nonprofits. So I think that just don't be totally profit-minded. Talk about unique businesses. Be doing what you're doing because you care about the business, about who you're impacting with that. I made a difference to creative people. I helped them find work and get their songs cut and become artists. The bottom line will take care of itself if you're doing right by your mission.
That's a great piece of advice, because success doesn't limit itself to profit. Success is the whole package together. All right, so everybody, you've been
some days.
Exactly. So everybody, you've been listening to the incredible story of Amy Kurland and the Nashville Bluebird Cafe. And Amy, thank you again for taking the time to be with us today.
My pleasure.
Thanks for tuning into the Inspired by Adventure podcast. We hope you enjoyed the show. If you haven't already, please subscribe through iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. See you next time.